I meditator. I've been meditating for over 50 years. I started out with transcendental meditation when I was in college. I was one of my first friends to start transcendental meditation. And, but at one time, a long time ago, I had a teacher, a meditation teacher who used to say that if you're doing any kind of serious spiritual practice, you should be reading the scriptures every day. You should be reading the scriptures every day. And he didn't say which scriptures. In fact, he said it didn't matter which scriptures, just scripture. And at that time, to me, scripture meant the Bible. And so I started reading the Bible every day. And I did that for a long time. I probably read the Bible from cover to cover at least a couple of times. And the Bible is really, whether you think it's the Word of God or not, it's a fascinating book. It's full of wisdom and also very entertaining. So I did that for a long time, but then over time, I stopped doing that. But then more recently, by more recently, I mean about 20 years or 25 years ago, I took up Zazen practice. And I thought that I should start reading the scriptures again. But now it seemed really appropriate to really kind of seriously delve into the Buddhist scriptures, which I had been sort of somewhat familiar with. Up to that point, I am a professor of philosophy and my specialization is Asian philosophy, especially Indian philosophy. And so I've taught Buddhism many times and have, and used scriptural texts in my classes, but I never really kind of systematically went through the Buddhist scriptures. And so that's what I started to do several years ago. And I found this to be very beneficial to my practice. And so that's really what I wanted to share with you in this workshop, some of the benefits of reading the scriptures, but also mainly to introduce you to the Buddhist scriptures and to show you sort of how to navigate them so that you can start reading them on your own yourselves. That's really the idea, so that you, to give you access to the Buddhist scriptures and show you some tools for doing that. It's a little bit paradoxical to be doing this in a Zen, for a Zen community in a Zen context, because the Zen tradition has always prided itself on being a transmission outside the scriptural tradition. So it's a direct transmission of enlightenment from one teacher to the next. And in Zen, they do not emphasize scriptural study, although, of course, as you know from being at the Bodhi, chanting is part of the practice. But actual study of the scriptures is usually not emphasized in Zen. But that's actually a little bit misleading, because Zen, we know from the stories of Zen patriarchs that, for example, the legend of Huineng, the sixth Chinese patriarch of Zen, says that he attained full enlightenment upon hearing the Diamond Sutra being chanted. And then the platform scripture has also been a very important text that Zen teachers over the history of Zen Buddhism, especially in China, have commented on. And but anyway, what I found is that studying scripture, reading scripture regularly has been very enriching and supportive of my practice in lots of ways, but most of these are rather intangible. And I'm hoping that some of you will also share with us the ways in which reading the scriptures have helped and supported you in your practice. But let me just, maybe I can just see a show of hands. How many of you now, off and on, read Buddhist scriptures? Just raise your hand. Yeah, okay. All right, very good. We actually are very fortunate that that we have now some very good modern translations of the Buddhist scriptures. The Buddhist scriptures were first translated into European language at around the end of the 19th century. A lot of the English translations appeared in a series of translations and editions published by the English Pali Text Society. But these older translations really are not intended for a general audience. I don't know if some of you have looked at them, but some of them are their sort of very precise literal translations that are intended to fix the meaning of the text for scholars. And they're really not, intended for a general readership. Or else some of them are written in a very kind of stilted, archaic language to make them sound like scriptures. And that can be kind of a little bit off-putting when we try to read them today, 100 years or 50 or 60 years after they were actually translated and published. But things really began to change in the 1990s when new, much more readable and yet very accurate translations began to appear. And many of these translations were produced by two American scholars, and I'm going to share my screen now. And I need someone to enable me to share the screen. It says, I'm getting a message here saying the host has disabled participant screen sharing, so I have to share my screen. I'm a co-host now. Thank you. That should do it. And I'm going to share this screen. All right, everybody see that? Bhikkhu Bodhi. Okay. Okay. All right. So there were two American Buddhist monks actually who began translating the Buddhist scriptures from Pali. Okay, and I'll be talking about Pali in a few minutes. In the 1990s, and one of these was Bhikkhu Bodhi. He was a Theravada monk. He actually trained in Sri Lanka and was fully ordained as a monk of the Theravada Buddhist order. And he began publishing translations of the discourses of the Buddha that appeared in hard copy. And I'm holding this up, but now I don't know if you can see it. Yeah. You can see this. So just look at, so this is one of the volumes of his series of translations of the discourses of the Buddha that appeared in Wisdom Publications. And I think the title of the series is The Teachings of the Buddha. And so he's now almost completed the entire, all of the discourses of the Buddha. So this was kind of one sort of revolutionary event in gaining access to the Buddhist scriptures. And then there was another monk, also American, but has a Buddhist name, Thanissaro Bhikkhu, who was trained in the Thai forest meditation tradition. and then returned after his training, returned to the United States, is now the abbot of Meta, the Meta Forest Monastery outside of San Diego. Some of you may have heard of that. And he also started publishing some very nice, accurate translations, but in plain English on a website called Access to Insight. And you can still, this website is still up, and you can look at most of his translations. They're organized quite nicely on that website. But then more recently, he's been posting his translations on his own website called Dharma Talks. And so both of these monks are superb translators who kind of set a new standard of clarity and readability for English translations of the Buddhist scriptures. But then more recently, we have another Western Buddhist monk called Bhante Sujato. I don't know exactly what the name of his organization is, but he also was trained in the Thai forest meditation tradition and then returned to Australia. He's Australian and is now situated, he has a center outside of Sydney. And in 2005, he put up a website called Sutta Central, Sutta Central. I love that name. So Sutta is a scripture. I'll be discussing the meaning of this term in a little bit. And this is a very much more ambitious and really much more sophisticated website that now offers translations of the entire Buddhist canon in Pali, but not just in Pali. Also, it provides some translations of versions of the scriptures in Chinese and Tibetan, and various other related texts. But it also, in addition, gives a great deal of background material on early Buddhism and the origin of the scriptures and the organization of the scriptures and all these kinds of things. And so this is the tool that I wanted to introduce you to today, and the main tool that we wanted to use in this workshop. So I'm going to go to this website, and we'll start looking at this website together a little bit. At this point, let me just pause and see if anybody has any. I'm going to stop share for a second and just see if there are any questions at this point, if you're following along with me. All right. Then let's go back to the screen. Okay. So I guess the point I would make is that I feel that we live in a very auspicious time in history when the Buddhist scriptures are really becoming available to the general public for the first time. And it's sort of comparable to what happened, I would say, what happened in Christianity back during the Renaissance and the Reformation, when scholars began to translate the Bible from Latin into modern languages like French and German and English. So Martin Luther was the translator of the German Bible, and Wycliffe was the translator of the English Bible. And these translations made it possible for ordinary Christians to read their own scriptures for themselves, and without relying on a priest who knew Latin, and to study them and interpret them for themselves. And this resulted in an immense, really, diversification of Christianity that's known as the Protestant Reformation, but kind of an explosion and revitalization of Christianity since that time. And so that's really, we're kind of in the same kind of moment now, in my opinion, with Buddhism, where the Buddhist scriptures really, which, until the 19th century were only existed in ancient Asian languages, and then were gradually translated over the course of the 20th century, are now fully available in plain English, simply on an internet website, so that they're available to everyone, they're accessible to everyone, and now we who practice different forms of Buddhism, whether it's Zazen or Vipassana or some kind of chanting or whatever. There's so many different forms of Buddhism, but we all now have direct access to the source of all these traditions, and that's the Buddhist scriptures that go back to ancient times. All right, so and have any of you used these websites? Do any of you happen to know already of Sutta Central? Okay, you do. Okay, so that's okay. Can't see. I've lost your name now in my sharing, but there are a couple. That's Anna, right? Anna. Yeah, Anna does, and yeah. Anybody else? Okay, so at least there's one person who already kind of knows about it, and I think it's one of the best kept secrets around. And even scholars, even some colleagues in my field are just getting turned on to it and think that it's really, really excellent. Okay, so let's sort of talk a little bit about what are the Buddhist scriptures. Okay, so let's kind of just give you a rough overview. There are actually different versions of the Buddhist scriptures. There's a version in Chinese, or the three main versions, I would say. There's a version in Chinese, there's a version in Tibetan, and there's a version in an ancient Indian language called Pali. That's this here, Pali. And the Pali version is actually the oldest and the most complete version of the scriptures. It was compiled just a couple of centuries after the passing of the Buddha. Okay, so the Buddha, there's a dispute about the dates of the Buddha. Some scholars say he passed away in around 480 BC. Others say it's more like 380. But in any case, probably just a few centuries already after the passing of the Buddha, his discourses were being compiled and organized by a certain school of Buddhism or a certain sect of Buddhism that has existed from that time into the present, and that's the Theravada school. Okay, so the Theravada collected the teachings of the Buddha and preserved them in Pali. And Theravada is the form of Buddhism that's practiced even today in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. So in Burma, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and so forth, Theravada Buddhism. And so the language Pali is a very ancient language. It's derived from Sanskrit, and some scholars think that it's the language that, or it's close to the language that the Buddha himself spoke. In fact, there's some people who think that it's actually was his language, perhaps not his mother language, but the language that he taught in. So Pali, the Pali collection, or another word is the canon, C-A-N-O-N, the canon, the Pali canon, is the most complete collection of the scriptures that we have. In the Chinese canon, we have translations of scriptures of other ancient Buddhist sects. And these translations sometimes vary from the Pali versions of the same scriptures. Moreover, in the Chinese canon, we don't have a complete collection of the scriptures of any other school. So it's really only the collection of the Theravada school, which is in Pali, that is the complete comprehensive collection of the scriptures, and which has served really as the main point of reference for the study of early Buddhism in modern times. This website then, Sutta Central, contains the entire Pali canon, okay? But it doesn't just have that. It also has, it has translations of all of the texts, all of the parts of the Pali canon. But it also then additionally has parallel texts that are found in the Chinese and Tibetan canons. It has the original text in Pali. It has several different English translations, modern ones and older ones, but it also has numerous translations in other modern languages. And finally, it contains a great deal of background information about the history of early Buddhism, the formation of the canon, the origin of the scriptures, and how they're organized. Okay, so that's what I want to start to introduce you to today. And I think the best place to start, but let me just, I've talked quite a bit already, and let's just be sure there aren't any questions at this point. Does anybody have a question? Okay, yes, Charlesy. Charles Lee, hello.
Oh, hello, yes. Oh, no, that was just me answering, I think, yes to a previous question.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah, no, I don't have a question.
All right. All right, well then I'll keep going then. Let's go back to share and look at this website a little bit. So this is the home page. This is the home page. And if you scroll down a little bit from the top of the home page, you find this box, what's here? And this is really the introduction to the website. Okay, so if you click on introduction, and here we go. So this is introduction to Sutta Central. Sutta Central contains early Buddhist texts known as the Tipitaka, or three baskets. Okay, so that is the traditional word for the complete collection of the Buddhist scriptures, the three baskets, where a basket is like a container or a division, really. So the Buddhist scriptures are divided into these three collections. And this is a large collection of teachings attributed to the Buddha or his earliest disciples who were teaching in India around 2,500 years ago. They're regarded as the sacred canon in all schools of Buddhism. It talks about themes, but if we go down to content, this is sort of the first explanation he gives of how the scriptures are organized. So what are these three baskets? Buddhist texts are traditionally classified as the three baskets, spelled Tipitaka in Pali or Tripitaka in Sanskrit. Okay, so you see how these words are very similar to each other. Pali is derived from from Sanskrit, and so the only difference is that in Sanskrit we have a tree, which is three, and in Pali that becomes a T. But anyway, these are the three baskets. First of all, we have the discourses or suttas in Pali or sutra in Sanskrit. So a sutta or a sutra is a discourse. Sometimes you see people calling them sermons or talks, okay? And the exact etymology of the word sutta or sutra is unknown. There's some uncertainty about it, but one explanation of the word sutta in Pali is something that's well said, su-ukta, sutta. So it's a discourse, an elegant, persuasive discourse. These are the primary texts, okay, consisting of records of teachings or conversations by the Buddha or his disciples and arranged by literary style or subject matter. Okay, so what we'll look at soon is actually how these discourses are arranged. So, but that's one division or one Pitaka, the discourses. And then the second division is monastic law or Vinaya. These contain the famous list of rules for monks and nuns. So the do's and don'ts that monks and nuns have to follow in their monastic practice. But they are much more than that, including many details of community life and a multitude of stories about life in ancient India. So a lot of the rules that we find in the Vinaya are explained by stories that tell on what was the occasion for the Buddha formulating this particular rule. And it usually has to do with some problem of practice, some dispute or some unclarity about a point of practice in the community. And these stories kind of give sort of offer a window into the life of the earliest Buddhist community at the time of the Buddha himself. Okay, and then we have Abhidhamma. And Abhidhamma texts are systematic summaries and analyses of the teaching drawn from the earlier discourses. Sometimes I call Abhidhamma, it's like catechism. So there's certain concepts that you learn to study and you work them up to sort of summarize the teaching so that you can eventually be able to deliver the teaching and spread the teaching to others. So those are the three baskets right there, the discourses, monastic law, and Abhidharma. Okay, so this, if we go back then to the homepage, you see then that these three baskets are arranged across the top of the homepage. Okay, so, and the one that we're going to be most interested in is the Basket of Discourses. Okay, so these are the sermons, these are the teachings, the direct teachings of the Buddha himself. Now, whether they're actually the actual words of the Buddha, whether they actually go back to occasions when the Buddha, during his lifetime when he was delivering some teaching to someone, that's something that's disputed. Even if it's clear from how they're written that even if they do go back to the original words of the Buddha, they were sort of shaped and edited by subsequent generations of his followers, and before they were included in the canon. And so we'll look at some of these. For example, a lot of them contain a lot of repetition, and it's sort of a little bit implausible. The Buddha, in his actual discourses, would have repeated himself over the same paragraph over and over again 10 times. Okay, but nevertheless, the core, maybe some of the most striking words of a discourse, and sometimes you come across certain details that seem true to life, and make it quite plausible that this discourse must have been delivered in an actual, but actually by the Buddha in a situation, in an encounter with someone. So let's look at the discourses here. Okay, so this is the first of the 3 Pitakas. Okay, and you see we have these different collections. Okay, any questions at this point? Okay, so we have the long discourses, the middle discourses, the linked discourses, the numbered discourses, and the minor discourses. Okay, so those are the 5 divisions, the 5 subdivisions of the Basket of Discourses. And there's a word for these subdivisions. The word is Nikayas. Sometimes you'll come across this word. These are the five divisions of the Basket of Discourses. Okay, so these are the 5 Nikayas, and so this is how the teaching of the discourses were organized. So here you have to think of kind of the situation of the Buddha, and the fact that he had a very kind of different biography from say Jesus. Okay, if you look at the teachings of Jesus as they're contained in the Gospels of the New Testament, you see that his sermons and his sayings are woven into a narrative of his life, starting from his birth to his crucifixion and resurrection. Let me ask everybody to just please turn off to mute their microphone so we don't get background noise. Thank you. So in the Gospels, the teachings of Jesus are woven into this narrative of his life. But Jesus really didn't live very long, and he really didn't have that much opportunity to compile a huge body of work. Unlike the Buddha. So according to the biographies of the Buddha, he attained enlightenment when he was 35 or 40 years old, perhaps. And then for 40 years after that, he wandered from place to place throughout India. And he taught, and he converted people, and he formed a community of monks and also a community of nuns. And he built up this following, and really this sangha, the community, and the institutions of this community. And so over 40 years, then there were many occasions when he delivered talks and discourses and lectures, or whatever you want to call them. And these were all, according to the tradition, they were all memorized by his followers on the spot. They were committed to memory and then passed down orally among his followers, so that by the time the Buddha attained nirvana, there was this huge mass of all of these discourses. We're just talking about his discourse, his teachings delivered in talks and sermons over the course of his lifetime. We're talking about thousands of them, several thousands of them. And so the question is, well, how do you organize these? Well, how do you organize these in a canon, in a comprehensive collection of his discourses? Well, one principle was that some of them were quite long. So some of them, come to like 30 or 40 pages in transcript. And those all sort of, naturally seem to belong together. And so these were collected together in the long discourses. This is a collection of long discourses. The Diga means long, the Diga Nikaya, okay? But then there were other discourses that weren't as long, but they weren't real short either. And they were really sort of cohesive lectures around a particular theme that had a beginning, middle, and end. And so there were a lot of these that seemed to belong together, 360 of them, or 361. And these were collected together as the middle discourses, or the middle length discourses. This is the Majjhima Nikaya. Majjhima means middle length. But then you had still a huge quantity, thousands of much, much shorter discourses. Well, how do you organize those? Well, some of them were related together around certain themes, okay? And so these were collected in, sorry, if I go back, and these were collected in the so-called linked discourses, or another word is connected, linked or collections of linked or connected discourses and other related texts, okay? And then finally, you had the shorter discourses, another collection of shorter discourses that grouped them together according to numbers of things that were mentioned in these discourses. And so this is a collection of numbered discourses. And this is the Anguttara Nikaya. And we can just kind of look at this, actually. We're going to jump into this right away. So here we have the numbered discourses collection, okay? And they give a very nice kind of sort of description of it under the heading before you actually open them. The numbered or numerical discourses are usually known as Anguttara Nikaya. It gives you the abbreviation, which you often see reference to. Also known as the Ekottara. These organized texts in numbered sets from 1 to 11. Compared to the other Nikayas, so collections of discourses, they're more oriented to the lay community. And then it talks about the Chinese translation of this collection of discourses, which is not the translation of the Theravada version, but it's perhaps belongs to that of another school. It certainly belongs to that of another school. And so if we then open this up, then we see how it's organized. So these are the numbered discourses. The first book is the book of discourses about one things, book of discourses about two things, the threes, the fours, the fives, the sixes, and so on and so forth, and all the way down to the 11s, okay? So these are collections, like once again, of shorter suttas that talk about a certain list of things, okay? And so going just into the book of fives, this is then subdivided further. There's the first 50, the second 50, the third 50, the fourth 50, the fifth 50, the sixth 50, and so forth. Not always exactly 50, but around that number. And so let's look at the fives here. And no, sorry. Let's look at hindrances. Okay, so now we get into individual suttas, and so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and so on, because we have, I don't know how many in this particular collection, but they all talk about five things. Okay, so let's look at an example. The 5 hindrances weaken wisdom, like side channels weaken a river's flow. Okay, so here you have, so this is one sutta, and here you have 2 translations in English. And these are both modern translations. There's one by Bhikkhu Sujato, and one, or Bhante Sujato sometimes, another by Bhikkhu Bodhi. And then we have an edition of the Pali text. This is the text in Pali. This is the original text. And then here we have 14 translations in other modern languages. We have in German, Spanish, French, Indonesian, Italian, Portuguese, so on and on. Okay. If we just go back, let's just look at Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation here. Thus have I heard. Okay, so often the discourses begin with this statement, and they indicate that this discourse is being recited, was originally recited by someone who was present at the time that the Buddha delivered the discourse. And usually that was the monk Ananda. Thus have I heard on one occasion, then it says where the Buddha was. So the Buddha was usually wandering from place to place, but he had different centers where he would go, and different places where he even had an ashram or two, and where he was received and accommodated by his followers. And so one of these was at Savatthi. Savatthi was a city in ancient India, in Jeta's Grove at Anathapindika's park. Anathapindika was one of his patrons, one of his lay patrons. There, the Blessed One addressed the bhikkhus. So the bhikkhu are the monks. Bhikkhu is a word for monk. Bhikkhus, Venerable Sir, they reply. The Blessed One said this: bhikkhus, there are these 5 obstructions or hindrances, encumbrances of the mind, states that weaken wisdom. What 5? Sensual desire is an obstruction and a hindrance, an encumbrance of the mind, a state that weakens wisdom. Ill will, ... and the ... means the repetition of the rest of the sentence that preceded. So ill will is an obstruction, a hindrance, an encumbrance of the mind, a state that weakens wisdom. 3, dullness and drowsiness are obstructions, hindrances, encumbrances of the mind, states that weaken wisdom. Restlessness and remorse and doubt is an obstruction, and so on. These 5 obstructions, hindrances, encumbrances, these are the 5 obstructions, hindrances, encumbrances of the mind, states that weaken wisdom, and so forth. And then he says, bhikkhus, without having abandoned these 5 obstructions and so forth, it's impossible that a bhikkhu, a monk, with his powerless and feeble wisdom, might know his own good, the good of others, or the good of both, or realize a superhuman distinction in knowledge and vision worthy of the noble ones. We're worthy of those who are awakened. Those are the noble ones. Suppose a river were flowing down from a mountain, traveling a long distance with a swift current carrying along much flotsam. Then on both of its banks, a man would open irrigation channels. In such a case, the current in the middle of the river would be dispersed, spread out, and divided so that the river would no longer travel a long distance with a swift current, carrying along much flotsam. So too, without having abandoned these 5 obstructions, and he names them again, ... it's impossible that a bhikkhu ... might realize that a bhikkhu might know his own good, the good of others, the good of both, and so forth, and might realize a superhuman distinction in knowledge. So there you have, there's several things, features to talk about, that you see the repetition in the sutta that was probably added by later generations of monks who edited the suttas in order to emphasize the most important points. So you would memorize, a monk might memorize a particular sutta if he has, say, an issue with these hindrances. And this repetition will kind of drill into his mind the most important things for him to know. You see how, this sutta really immediately speaks to the practice of the monk, but not just a monk, also one of us. So a lay follower, someone who's practicing zazen, someone who's practicing vipassana. There are these hindrances to practice. Sensual desire, I mean, the Buddha was very emphatic about this. This is an obstruction. You have to reduce it somehow. It interferes with your practice. And all these other things, that's of course more important for monks than it is for lay people, but it's not entirely without importance for lay people. And then all of these are the things. How are they obstructions? How are they hindrances? They make it more difficult to meditate. What he'll say, they obstruct your meditation, and they obstruct insight also. So he's not talking about meditation, he's talking about insight. And then the rest of it, the final paragraph, is having abandoned these 5 obstructions, then a monk is able to know his own good, the good of others, the good of both, and so realize superhuman distinction in knowledge, and so on and so forth. And that's usually, it's sort of, first he says, he's talking about things like obstructions and hindrances and so forth. Or, first he'll talk about how they interfere with practice, and then he'll come back and say how if you are able to abandon or overcome these hindrances, how you're able to make progress in practice. So this is a very common sort of structure to these discourses. And so why does this discourse, why is it found in the Anguttara Nikaya? Because it's a discourse that centers around a list of 5 things, and it belongs in the division of the 5s in this collection of discourses that organizes, of shorter discourses that organizes them according to the number of things mentioned. So once again, the Book of Ones, the Book of Twos, the Book of Threes, and then that is the numbered discourse collection, and that is one of the 5 collection of the discourses, one of the 5 Nikayas. Okay, so I know that was kind of, I went kind of fast, but and it's just really kind of a glimpse into just one small part of the structure and organization of the scriptures. But I think that it gives you a sense of sort of how to begin to orient yourself and begin to find your way around. And really, you have to kind of sample for yourselves and just experiment and see what you like and what you don't like. And so once again, before we go to questions, I'll just remind you that on the website, so on the Sutta Central website, I would suggest starting with the introduction and reading through that. And then, but then there's also a very good sort of helpful hints on how to read the suttas. These are by Bhante Sujato, and this comes under the link getting started. And so I suggest looking at that. And then finally, I would, under Basket of Discourses, which is what we'll be focusing on. So next week, we'll meet again in a week. We'll start out with a discourse that's contained in the linked discourses. And this is what is traditionally considered the first sermon or the first discourse that the Buddha gave. And so we'll be looking at that. But if you want to know more about the discourses, I suggest that you also have a look at this essay, Conversations with the Buddha. And here it gives quite a bit of historical background to origins, sort of, where discourses, how they originated, how they were transmitted orally, and then finally compiled into a canon around probably the 3rd century before Christ. And then also it talks about early schools of Buddhism. Here it will mention the Theravada, which once again is the school that has preserved the Pali canon. It once again gives you information about the organization of the discourses, and then the canonicity. That means the authenticity, whether they're actually the words of the Buddha or not. Okay, but I think I'll stop there and just kind of turn it back to you just for questions or any questions at this point, and then we'll turn it back over to Hossein. Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, John, are the numbered discourses unique to that section, or are they culled from the longer and the medium, the middle length?
Yeah, no, good question. They're just found in that section. Okay, so you might have, yeah, so that's a good question, because you might, you're going to have, longer discourses, and middle length discourses that do mention, to do present you with lists, numbered lists, but they're not also found in the numbered discourses. They're just those, the longer discourses are just found in the collection of longer discourses and so on. Yes, Susan. Unmute yourself.
No, I didn't have a question. I was waving at somebody that was outside my window.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. Yeah, somebody just walked by and they were waving and I waved back to them.
Okay.
But, no, yeah, it's been very interesting though, yes. I'm looking forward to reading all this.
Okay, good. Jan.
In that last slide that you showed talking about transmission and canonicity, I was wondering about the attribution of the suttas. Is it in general known who the original author was, or the location where the manuscripts were found, the historical path by which they were delivered to the original, to the translators that actually recorded these in the different languages?
Right. No, we really don't have much information about that at all. It's all sort of, we're all kind of very much in the dark about that, about, how they were transmitted, how they were edited, who did the editing, what principles they followed in editing. A lot of these things, a lot of these details have to be kind of inferred from materials that we have. And that there's a whole field of scholarship that does that. That's really the field of Pali studies. But as far as the authorship goes, or the who was the author, traditionally Buddhists think that the Buddha was the author. if a discourse is attributed to the Buddha in the sutta, if it starts out, thus have I heard on this particular, the occasion, the Buddha was present at this location, and there were 1,500 monks with him, then that's taken to be that's taken at face value, and it's accepted that this discourse goes back to the Buddha himself. Although most Buddhists are willing to accept that the what do I want to say, the style of the language may have been edited and refined, and that the repetition may have been added later, and these features may not go back to the Buddha, but the event, most Buddhists believe that the event actually occurred, that the Buddha delivered a discourse at that time to those individuals, and there are quite a few modern scholars who accept this. And when you read on the Sutta Central website about canonicity, of course, you're reading something that was written by a Buddhist monk. Bhante Sujata is a Buddhist monk, and so he accepts the tradition that the discourses go back to the Buddha. But he's very good at defending that belief. He's very good at marshaling all of the historical evidence for that. Mariona.
Are there any of these discourses written by Buddha himself, or they were all passed by word and then?
They were all spoken. So at the time of the Buddha, they didn't have writing in India. So writing, we have no evidence of writing in India until about the 3rd century, or the 3rd or 4th century, I think 3rd century BC. And so he spoke, and traditionally, scriptures were transmitted orally in ancient India. They were not written down. Even the ancient Hindu scriptures, the Vedic scriptures, were transmitted orally for centuries, perhaps thousands of years, before they were ever written down.
Thank you.
Michelle, unmute yourself.
Sometimes scholars speak of 18 early schools.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if there are different transmission lineages of the scriptures related to those schools.
Yes, exactly. And the essay that I mentioned, I'll share just again very briefly to show you where this is. So in this essay, so this is on the homepage. This is the Basket of Discourses. Then Bhante Sujata has an essay on it's giving background to the discourses. He has a section here where he talks about the early schools, the different schools, and that's correct, that different schools had their own versions of the scriptures that they transmitted independently through their own lineage. Most of these have been lost. Most of these have them, but a few have been preserved in Chinese translations. So the discourses that were translated into Chinese were discourses from other ancient lineages, other ancient schools. And that's very helpful because we're able then to compare their versions with the complete Pali version, and there's certain very interesting differences.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, but of course, all of this is good to know sort of in the background for yourself, but it's not necessary to know in order to get the benefit of just reading the scriptures yourself. And I think you saw immediately from reading the text that we read, just this short little sutta about the hindrances, that it's very practical. It's very relevant to what you might be doing in any numbers of ways. Of course, that varies from individual to individual. And so that's what I found in my own reading of the scriptures, is that there are all these kind of surprising benefits. And that's what we want to tune into as we, in future weeks, as we look specifically at some of the discourses. Okay, well, I think then at this point, I'll turn it back to Hossein.
John, thank you so much for this introduction. It's a very useful introduction.